Good morning, everybody, on a nice snowy day. Hope everybody is staying safe, and we will be starting here in a little over a minute, minute and a half, just letting people sign in, get started right just after the top of the hour. And I'll have to reset my wall clock again. It tends to run slow. I don't know why. Okay, we'll give folks about another 20, 30 seconds to log in, and then we will get started. Okay, good morning. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the Cornell Local Roads program. We're your New York State LTAP Center. And this is one of our special webinars we're adding into the pile, dealing with combating roadway departures. It's part of a pair of webinars we're doing specially for the New York State Department of Transportation's Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. They had some leftover funds from the previous call. There'll be some different rules involved, and we'll be talking about those funds and some other things later this month. So a couple of special Thursday webinars. We have our standard webinars, which happens to just by coincidence be concentrated on road safety this month because we had work zones on Tuesday, and we have traffic safety next Tuesday. And we're doing a session on grants and funding on the 24th, but we're also going to be doing a full workshop, a 3-hour, 3.5-hour PDH, 4-hour total webinar on local federal aid, sort of walking through the process a week from today. So it's a bunch of stuff out there if you've got safety issues, and we hope that's why you're signed up, so you can help spend some of the funds that are left over. And again, we'll be talking about those in more detail. And then we will be finishing up our spring webinar series in March. And then finally, we'll be starting up our spring workshops shortly thereafter that. So we're looking forward to a busy couple of weeks here with webinars and then getting into our spring workshops. And hopefully spring is coming. I know it is. It'll get there eventually. So if you haven't been on one of these webinars, just a reminder, on your lower left, there is your audio settings. We would ask you to open up your chat pod and your Q&A pod. The chat pod is one way. You can't type into the chat, but that's where we'll drop in links so you can do the polls and get the handout and stuff like that. I may ask you to raise your hand a few times during the hour. And then, of course, the Q&A is where you can put in questions. And they can be related to the class. I may be asking you questions via the Q&A, or you might be having issues. You can type them in there as well if you've got a concern. And you could just say good morning like Al just did. That's fine. Now, this is worth one professional development hour here in New York State. Only the person registered. It is considered a course, but that's not as critical as it used to be. If you're from outside New York State, you'll need to check with your LTAP center for that. Now, there is a handout that goes with this. And again, it's going to magically show up in your chat here if you've opened your chat up. And I will find it. I know I have it open here. You get too many files open sometimes. There it is. So there's a handout. It has an outline of what we're talking about today. It actually talks a little bit about what we're talking about next week with the funds. We won't get into that too much today, but we'll get into a lot more next week. And then a lot of resources, and those resources are something you definitely want to be looking at later on. So again, that's in the chat, and you may want to take advantage of that. Now, there are other resources available for all of this, and you can always give us a call or send us an email and things like that. Now, let's figure out, oh yes, a good point. If you can't access the handout because you've got restrictions, just email us, Amanda at ael234@cornell.edu, and she can send it to you directly, or just clrp@cornell.edu, or Barbara will send it to you. We'll get it to you one way or the other. Let's do a little welcome with some polls to see who you are. Okay, and so let's first off, who do you work for? Town, county, city or village, state or federal, tribal, MPOs, authorities like the Thruway Authority, consulting firm, contractor. or you're just working for a living. And we got quite a few working for a livings today. Okay. So we got quite a few. Okay. Because everybody's working for a living, right? Okay. We got a lot of humor today. That's good. Okay. What is your job? So are you an administrator, a highway superintendent, an engineer, a planner, field crew, supervisor, elected board member? Your job is whatever the boss tells you to do. We have some of those I see, and then none of the above. And I suspect we'd be dominated by engineers, and yeah, sure enough, the results do show that. Quite a few planners, probably MPO folks. That's cool. Okay. And then how long have you been in your position? Uh, Less than a year, 20 plus years? Okay. Okay. So a good variety of folks, some with less than a year. Okay. And the last question that helps me out quite a bit is where are you from here in New York State? You can just click on the map. Okay. And by the way, just as a reminder, if you can't access the polls, just open up the Q&A pod and throw the answer in there, and I'll take advantage of that and read those through too. Okay, should be able to click on the map. Oh, we have somebody from Ontario, way up in the North Country. Okay. And we have folks all over the state, New York City, Long Island, all along the Thruway, Southern Tier. Okay. And a couple of Canadians. Now, why do we care about roadway departures? Why is that a critical issue? Well, it comes back to the fact that we want people to get home safely every single day. And if you look at fatalities across the United States, they have gone up quite a bit. Something happened during COVID, and there was a big spike, 30 to 35% jump in fatalities and serious crashes. In New York State, we're getting close to 1,000, and all of a sudden we're up a little bit on average. We're actually doing pretty good here in New York State, but every state really could use a lot lower fatality crash rate. And so what we're really going to try to do is focus on that issue. Now, FHWA has three crash focus areas. They like to focus on roadway departures, intersections, and bicycles and pedestrians. So we'll talk about why here, but those are their focus crash areas. And we're talking today about roadway departures. Just so you know, New York State is developing an intersection safety action plan. They've already got a bicycle and pedestrian one that's older, and they're going to revisit and do another one of those later on. So there are action plans, and yes, funding to go with them, to improve those crash focus areas. And we'll talk about why here in just a minute. Now, what do I mean by these? Well, an intersection crash focus area could be something like this. Now, the person only gets a broken arm. It looks severe, but they actually only get a broken arm, amazingly enough. Okay, and it's a good example of two wrongs don't make a right. The person was walking against the cross symbol. Person went through a red light. Everybody loses in that case. Okay, and that's an intersection issue, obviously, but it's also a pedestrian bicycle. So it'd be a joint combined in that particular case. And just as a reminder, we can't solve every single problem. We get people going through lights. We get people who do things which, are completely unsafe. I'll actually repeat this one for you. Watch carefully and think if this had happened 5 seconds later. Instead of getting through the intersection, it could have been a fatality. Because we know that if a person is walking, their chances of walking away go down dramatically if they get hit by a vehicle. Even at 42 miles an hour, it's a 50-50 chance of being killed. And by the time you get up to 58, just above the state speed limit, the chances of getting killed jump about 90%, and it's about a 99% chance of a serious life-changing injury or fatality. So again, that's part of the reason why intersections and pedestrians are one of the crash focus areas. But roadway departures, if you add up all of the fatalities, make up over half of all the fatalities. Okay? So in that particular case, that's why we're focusing first on roadway departures. And when it comes to roadway departures, we really want to focus on the most critical kinds of crashes. The head-on crashes, rollover crashes, and hitting of fixed objects. And if you look at the fatalities, what gets hit leaving the roadway? Trees are by far the biggest culprit in a lot of ways. But yes, poles, barriers, not berries, I need to put an R in there. I'll do that afterwards here. You always catch things when you're doing the presentations. But there are things we can strike. So let's make sure we're on the same page of what I mean by roadway departure and these three primary head-on rollovers and trees. So a head-on crash is when somebody leave for roadway departures is when they leave the roadway or they leave the lane. Okay, so this crash here where somebody actually had a medical emergency, left the lane and hits this bus, that is considered a roadway departure. They departed from where they belonged. And yes, I know a lot of the public would think of this as a lane departure, but really what we're focusing on is a departure from the normal driving, the leaving what is their safe part of the roadway. And that's the term that's used. Okay, so that's a head-on type of situation. Okay, versus a rollover. Okay, and leaving the roadway. This is on an interstate. And this vehicle, if you watch the vehicle, it never actually goes off of the entire paved surface, but it's still a roadway departure and it's a rollover. Rollovers are very dangerous because a lot of people don't wear their seatbelts or they get ejected from the vehicle, or there's just such a violence to it. In this case, the person actually does walk away with minor injuries because the vehicle did its job, but they're probably never going to think of driving the same way again. And if you look carefully at the video, the person who actually sort of started all this, they never actually stopped. They just kept going. And then, of course, trees. The reason trees are so dangerous is because when we hit them with any kind of speed, it's really not good for anybody. At 30 miles an hour, you can see what happens when you hit a simulated tree. It's pretty dangerous. At 43, it starts to get into the compartment where people are. And by the time you get to 55 miles an hour, it's almost assuredly a fatal crash if you get a big enough tree. Any tree above about 4 inches in diameter can be a fixed object. And depending on the species, even smaller than that, because they don't fail the way you would expect them to fail. They're ductile in a lot of ways. So those are the three focus areas. So again, a quick question for you just to see if you remember, what are those three crash focus areas that I talked about? And see if you can put those three crash focus areas in for me. We'll see how we do here. Everybody gets the point. Again, if you can't access the polls, please throw it in the Q&A, which is fine. Pedestrians? Mm-hmm. Intersections and roadway departures. Yeah, very good. Yeah. So those are the three focus areas, and then there's sub-focus areas within each one, within the safety action plans. And let's just remind ourselves of why that's so critical. We look at those national statistics. These are percentages pre-COVID. They changed slightly coming out of COVID, but they're still pretty much the same overall, and that is roadway departures only. Just crashes that are roadway departures, like the one we saw with the rollover or the changing of the lanes, that's 44% by itself in terms of fatalities, okay? And then about another 5.5% where it's combined with about another 5 to 10% that is dealing with intersections and pedestrians and bicycles. If you add it all up, half of the fatalities occur because of roadway departures. So that's why we tend to want to focus on that particular area. Okay, so that's why I'm going there first. So New York State has a roadway departure safety action plan. There were funds to go with those. Okay, there are some appendices. They're in the handout, so make sure you download that. You may want to look at them. I really advise reading the appendices that go with it because they've got some really good data and information that's in there. And of course, part of the reason we're doing these webinars is there is money available. Now, there's money still available at the federal level through SS4A. Those funds get released on a semi-regular basis. But more importantly right now is there are some funds available for the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. Originally, it was 90 million. Some of those funds have been spent, but not all. And that's why we're doing these webinars. And in 2 weeks, we'll talk specifically about the process for accessing and putting a project plan in for that. But today we're going to focus on the problem of what is combating roadway departures. And then next week can join us for dealing with the federal aid process because these are matched to federal funds. So they've got a federal aid process that goes with them. Now you'll hear me use different terms and people use very different terms with crash levels. So you may hear the term K, which means killed. the same as a fatal. You may see the term IA or just I, okay, or just A. Um, those are severe crashes. Those are life-changing crashes, okay. B means it's an injury, but it's not a life-changing one. A broken arm would be considered a B kind of injury where you go to the hospital and there's a acute problem. You're going to have some care, but it's not life-changing like a serious concussion or even a loss of a limb or something like that. And then, of course, a minor injury, you might even not go to the hospital, just cuts and abrasions, treated on scene, and then, of course, property damage only. Now, I went online. Of course, Clear was being not happy with me yesterday, so I had to leave my old slide up here. I apologize for that, but the ratios are still about the same. This was when we did a similar webinar about a year ago, and as you can see, it's actually about 5 months into the year. And you can see there were actually already about 668 people killed. It was higher than we'd like to see, but that number actually turned out to be okay for 2024. Um, you can see there's about 10 times, 9 times as many serious crashes, less minor injuries, and then, just cuts and scrapes and abrasions as most crashes. There's a lot of crashes out there. And we would love to get rid of all the crashes. That'd be great, right? Yeah, the problem is that we might be chasing our tail and we might not be able to solve the problem. And I'm willing to trade some serious crashes, um, get rid of them for a few extra property damage crashes only. So we tend to focus on the KIA, or the killed and seriously injured crashes. Now, why do you think FHWA and NYSDOT want to focus on those type of crashes? Tell me what you think. Why do you think that's a good idea to focus on those most serious types of crashes where people are killed or there's a fatality? So yeah, dead equals bad. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. It's got the highest consequences. Yeah. So it's an interesting thing. Okay. So keep that in mind. That's what the focus is. Again, it's not that we want to have any crashes. We'd love to have every single person get home every day with no crashes at all, but we really want them to get home and not have their life dramatically changed or even ended because of a single mistake. That shouldn't happen. Okay? And as a note that Robert Zatowski with the state DOT is on today, and he's making a note that they're finalizing, looking at how many funds were spent in those initial 90 million. And there's going to be an application. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. So keep that in mind if you've got a safety issue, and we'll talk more about that during this hour and, of course, in a couple of weeks. So again, the cost and long-term consequences of the serious and deadly crashes are really the key issue for this more than anything else. Okay. And just to clear it, I did see someone in the Q&A would like a link of the simulated tree crash video. I'll have to check and see. I know we can use it in the training. I don't know if we can post it. I'll have to check and see on that. We do have a copy of the presentation, a video. You can actually watch it and see the segment, but whether we can actually share the actual one, that's a question I don't know the answer to. I'll have to check on that for you. Now, what is the roadway departure concept? Well, the idea is, first and foremost, keep the vehicle on the road, or better yet, in their lane, where they belong. We do that, at least in terms of away from an intersection, going to be in pretty good shape. If they, have a road like this, they can stay in the lane, we're happy. Now, if they do leave the lane, they go off onto the shoulder, or they even go off the shoulder completely, we want to make sure there's a reduced potential for a crash. And it does happen, like it or not. So in this case, we want to have things like good clear zones and breakaway hardware and stuff like that that keeps people from even having any kind of crash whatsoever. And then, of course, minimizing that severity where, again, that roadway hardware can make a huge difference. Because now you may be able to get a property damage crash, but that's it. So that's the idea, minimize the severity. And once we've done this, we may want to look again and say, well, maybe here we need to think about more to keep the vehicle on the roadway, because it's also cheaper, by the way. Now, in terms of keeping the vehicle on the roadway, one of the most common things are stripes, good width on the pavements, good shoulders, things like that. Those are all important. In terms of reducing the potential for a crash, well, that's important. One of the most common problems we actually have is people running off the roadway and then they lose control. So I'm going to show a video. We'll see if the video decides to play today. This is a simulated test at the Texas Transportation Institute out. They do crash testing. It's pretty fun to watch them. So this is an early 1980s test. So it's an older car, but watch what happens when they try to pull the vehicle back up off of a shoulder drop off. Okay? And you can see they lose a little bit of control when they come back. And of course, if this had been an actual roadway, they would have gone into the other lane. And you all have had that happen when you go off and you're like, I got to get back on the lane. And if you don't slow down before you do it, that can be a bit of an issue. And again, I'll show this again. It got a little bit stubborn. Let's see if I can get it to show it one more try. I'm brave enough. Okay? So watch carefully and hopefully it won't digitize too badly on you. And yeah, it did a little better this time. Okay, so again, we want to reduce the potential for the crash. And finally, when the crash occurs, we want to minimize the severity of the crash. Now, there's a lot of people who think, let's just jump right to guide rail. We'll take care of the problem. And of course, for those who are not in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, they call it guardrail, but it's the same stuff. Uh, we don't minimize the severity, and we'll jump to guide rail. Well done guide rail can be very, very valuable, but poorly done guide rail, not so much. In this case, had the agency who owned this roadway not cut that tree down, when a truck hit a few weeks later, that truck deflected that rail 4 feet. It would have actually made the crash worse, would have directed the vehicle into the tree. So we want to make sure we minimize the severity by having good breakaway hardware, good barriers, good slope design, but we don't want to make the problem worse. So keep that in mind when it comes to roadway departures. Now, many of you probably had the 4 E's. Actually, let's just see, because there's a lot of engineers today. Raise your hand if in college you took a transportation engineering class and they talked about the 4 E's or the 3 E's, or even the 5 E's. I've seen 5 E's. Let's see how many of you. I figured Al would raise his hand. Yeah. Yeah, quite a few of you. Okay, I learned about the 3 E's in college, and by the time, I came here to Cornell, we had 4 E's, and it grew to 5, and then back to 4. And the idea was we're going to focus on those things to help make roadways safer. So we're going to focus on education, engineering, enforcement, and then the 4th E that's become the most common is the emergency response. That's the golden hour, getting people care. And I'm not arguing those 4 E's aren't fantastic. They are really good focuses. But what had happened over the years, it became very siloed. So the education component, we were just going to make drivers better somehow. And the engineering component, it was going to be up to the engineers. We were going to solve all the problems. And enforcement was over here by itself, controlling speeding. And emergency response just waited until something happened. And it became very siloed and not as efficient as it should be. So it's about a decade now, a little more actually. The Federal Highway Administration has a new term, but again, after a decade, it's really not new, called the safe system approach. Okay, and yes, you'll see safe systems listed a lot too, but the idea is we have an integrated system. Okay, and so we have safe road users, we have safe vehicles, we have safe roads, safe speeds, post-crash care, all the same 4 E's we had before. But the difference is we integrate them. We don't want to silo them. We want to realize that there is redundancy and that a single mistake shouldn't lead to a fatality. So we think about the safe road users by education, but we also want to educate the people maintaining the roadway. We want to educate the public. We want to educate elected officials. And we want to educate them for the other 4 aspects. When it comes to safe speeds, we want to enforce safe speeds, but we also want to design the roads so that people drive them at a safer speed automatically. A well-designed road can actually do this. You've all been on a roadway that was 30 feet wide when it probably was fine at 20 feet, and you tend to go a little bit faster. So again, safe speeds can be part of the design. And so safe roads, certainly we can do a lot, but we can only do so much, but we certainly have a role to play, both the highway agencies and the engineers. Post-crash care is still critical. That golden hour makes a huge difference. And then, of course, the safe vehicles. part of the reason we want the automated vehicles is that they're going to be safer if they're done well. But again, where are the holes? Where are the problems? We have to integrate these things. And the concept behind the safe system can be very important. So let's look at post-crash care, especially, let's say, a rural area. Okay? So it was one of the old 4Es, but let's focus on that and getting the golden hour. So let's go and look at, this is New York State. And if you're wondering where we're looking at, it's a little closed in. It's part of the Catskills and Southern Adirondacks. And if you're wondering, the star is Albany. And the scroll is here, Cornell. So it's the end of Cayuga Lake. Just to get a sense, and it's about a 3 to 3.5 hour drive, depending whether I have to stop for a pee break, to get from one to the other. So it gives you a sense of scale, right? Now, this map from a place called felt.com. I tried the GIS clearinghouse, but it was fighting with me. I got a map and found all of the hospitals, okay, that exist in this area, including outside of New York State, just if you had to go to a hospital. But then imagine this is just any hospital, and it may not have trauma care. So if you had needed a really high level, class 1, type 1, highest level hospital for serious crash injury, like maybe a brain injury, you'd want to go to a trauma center. Well, where are the trauma centers if you're in the middle of the Catskills? Well, they're not as close as you'd like them to be. There's one in Albany. There's actually two in Syracuse. Okay. And there's one down in Sayre, PA. Okay. Now, I can get to one to another by driving from Ithaca, but if you're in the Catskills, driving, it's going to take you a lot longer than that golden hour. You're going to have an air ambulance to even get close. And so we have to think about siloing because we don't want to get the post-crash care. That's the last choice if we're looking at a redundancy type model. Okay? Because the idea here is we have what's called the Swiss cheese model, redundancy that occurs. So even if the person isn't safe, even if the vehicle they're in has bald tires, even if they're going just a little too fast, if the roadway is forgiving, they have a crash, but they walk away. We don't have to get the post-crash care, but we try to integrate these things together, and that redundancy is absolutely critical. Okay? Now, a good example of redundancy, this is on an interstate, but it is rural. But watch carefully in the video. I just cut a longer video. Person has a medical emergency in the vehicle, so they're no longer a safe road user. They didn't even realize they were having a medical emergency. Okay? They had their kid in the car with them. But watch carefully as they run off the roadway. If they hadn't had a safe roadside, if the sign hadn't been breakaway, if the rail, which by the way is a fixed object, hadn't been designed properly, think about all the things you could have run off into. Instead, the sign broke away and they rolled into the median, well, the gore area, and they slowed down and stopped and walked away with property damage only. The mother and daughter were in good shape. So we didn't have to go to that post-crash care. So it makes a huge difference to have good redundancy. Now, when it comes to the safe systems approach, let's see if you can remember the components of the safe systems approach. There are 5. Okay, let's see what you come up with. And by the way, let's see if I got it here. I think I do, while you guys are putting your answer in. I got a sticker at the recent Transportation Research Board meeting that had 6 focus areas in it from another state. No, the ones I got only have 5. I got stickers. But the idea is it's a system. There's an overlap. And again, let's see what you come up with both on the screen and in the poll. If you can't access, you can use Q&A. So we have safe road users. Yep. Okay. Safe roads. That's good. Safe vehicles. Safe enforcement, or safe speeds, actually. That's where the enforcement comes in. They call it safe speeds now. Because if people self-enforce, you don't have to have the cops out there. And then emergency response. Okay? Cool. And again, that's the idea behind it. And rather than having things siloed like we used to do, we try to bring them all together. Okay? How many of you, by the way, recognized, you can raise your hand if you recognize that safe vehicle? Anybody see how many people recognize that safe vehicle? Yeah, I knew you would, Al. Did you ever own one is the question I want to know. That's the Corvair, by the way, if you're wondering. Ralph Nader called it unsafe at any speed. Um, I rode in one once, but I'd never owned one. So Now, one of the things that comes in to the safe systems approach and is really important when it comes to roadway departures is something called systemic safety. So it's something I want you to think about. We're going to come back and talk about systemic safety just a little bit more. And the idea behind systemic safety is it's a risk-based approach. It's sort of like rolling the dice, and you try to pick the places where you're going to have the most risk. Okay? We'll come back and talk a little more detail in just a minute. The other concept I want to put in your head is systematic safety. And yes, I apologize, the two words are really close to each other. So you could almost think about systemic safety, you could even call it risk-based safety, and systematic or system-wide safety or standard operating procedures, SOP type safety, where you do it over the entire system. It just becomes something you do all the time. And here is actually a perfect example. Now, it's not roadway departure, but it was a person who walked away with only an injury. Standard operating procedure is to wear a hard hat when you're out in a construction site. In this case, he was doing some tree trimming. You can see he had the proper hearing protection, he had the proper safety shield, and a tree limb that he was cutting decided it was a little rotten on the inside, so when they cut it at a certain point, it went snap. And the tree limb hit his head, actually punched a hole in the hard hat. That hole, however, failed ductily like it's supposed to, and he walked away with no serious injury because he was protected by a standard operating procedure. We do a session, and one of our webinars is on worker safety, and we talk about standard operating procedures. We do have to take some risks, so keep that in mind. And we're going to talk about some of the combating roadway departure things you can do, and whether they are systemic safety or systematic safety. Now, to understand the idea of systemic safety, let's look at fatal crashes between 2012 and 2014 in the southern tier. So here we have a map, and I'm just going to show the map. These are data from the FARS system, the Fatal Accident Reporting System for the Federal Highway Administration. And I'll just make them go up and down a couple of times so you can see. Okay? So look at that map and ask yourself, where would you spend your money if you were going to spend money here? Okay? Are you going to spend your money? I decided not to do a poll this time, but I've sometimes done this with a poll. But are you going to spend your money? Let me pick a color I'm not using. Here in Ithaca, there's two crashes right there that look like they're close. Or how about, there's a couple of here that are pretty close to each other. Ooh, there's a couple more. And it looks like there's some crashes that are close to each other. We're going to have a hotspot. We're going to focus on those areas. And there may be some hotspots, and we'll talk more about that when we come to the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan with New York State. They've actually highlighted some of the hotspots. But actually, a lot of those hotspots that you might think that are there may actually be pretty far apart. In fact, in this case, the closest crashes are over a half a mile apart from each other. So again, be careful when you're looking at a hotspot what that means. But it doesn't mean there aren't some. But the idea behind systemic safety is we don't wait for a hotspot to form. We go out and we look for the places that have the highest level of risk. And let me illustrate this. We're going to do some virtual dice rolls. It's easier to do this in person, but we'll do this virtually. Are you ready? First thing I want you to do is again, you don't need to type it in, just keep it in your head. First time I want you to choose a number, okay? I'll ask you to raise your hand in just a minute, okay? And I'm going to get my random little tool out here. I've got a little random tool on my phone, and I go find my random tool. But don't be stubborn today. Come on, random tool. There we go. Oh, come on. You're being stubborn. Well, I'm just going to do an actual dice roll here. Okay, if you chose 25, please raise your hand. Please raise your hand if you chose 25. Wow, only two of you chose 25. Interesting. Okay. So, the two of you that chose 25, keep that in your head. Okay. We have some money. We're going to take the money from the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan because you had a crash. We're going to go fix your problem. Okay. Now, everybody, choose a vowel. Everybody choose a vowel. Okay. I'm going to roll my dice. Okay. How many of you chose the letter O? Raise your hand if you chose the letter O. Okay. So eight, seven, eight of you. Okay, now, magically, watch this. Everybody's hands are going to get lowered. How many of you raise your hands both times? One person raised their hand both times. Oh, nobody. Hang on. Try again. Did you raise your hand both times? Okay, one person raised their hand both times. So one person, we fixed their problem. And by random chance, it occurred again at the same location. But that other money we spent, the next series of crashes didn't occur there. The idea behind systemic safety is to focus where there's high levels of risk. And the great thing about doing this is we start fixing problems before a crash occurs. I mean, I've been to way too many times in a meeting, especially public hearings, where somebody says, do we have to wait for someone to die or get seriously injured before we fix the problem? Well, the answer is no. What we do is we focus on the critical locations before a crash occurs. And we can do this developing something called a local road safety plan, which we'll be talking about a lot more detail in a couple of weeks. Okay, so there's a way to do this. Now, the other thing you can do is to just make it a standard operating procedure, like our friendly hard hat. Okay? So what I want to do is spend most of the rest of our time this hour going over some of the most common and low cost, not all, but some of the most common and low cost roadway departure proven countermeasures. I'm going to start with one that by far is maybe one of the most important ones we've got in the toolkit, and that's the clear zone. Okay? So what's a good clear zone? I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. If you suddenly had a tire blowout that going down this roadway and you needed to pull off to the right, raise your hand if you would pull off to the right if you had a tire blowout and you wanted to pull off. How many of you would pull off to the right? Yeah, you'd pull off to the right. Um, you want to get off the roadway. You don't want to, the vehicle was coming. You don't want to hit a vehicle going the other way. And so you'd feel like, oh, I'll just pull off into the grass. But don't go too far. Um, if you pulled off and you hit that tree stump, you'd have a really bad day. One of the most important things we can do when it comes to the highway, the roadway, is to have a good clear zone. And a consistent clear zone is pretty important. Now, how wide does that clear zone need to be? Surprisingly less than you might think. You may have heard the term, we need 30 feet. Well, maybe on an interstate, you need 30 feet. But on a local road, low volume, rural, 6 to 10 is more than adequate. There's actually good risk analysis, this same dice-based kind of approach. It shows that a good 6 to 10 foot consistent clear zone is actually very adequate from a safety standpoint. Okay? There are standards you can actually use that would meet that criteria, but you got to have consistency. This is actually a pretty good clear zone along this roadway, except for once in a while there's a culvert that's just a little short. And if a vehicle comes along and hits that culvert because it went off the roadway, could have a really bad day. We could solve that by widening that culvert out, by maybe even getting rid of that rail completely. And then the next most dangerous thing might be the utility pole. So what we do is we look for high levels of risk and we slowly remove them in the places where there are problems. We don't fix every single place immediately. Eventually, however, clear zone becomes a standard operating procedure. So we start the systemic and it becomes systematic. Okay? Now, gang mailboxes. Gang mailboxes are a good example of something that eventually probably should be a standard operating procedure, a systematic approach. But if you've got places where you know you have a lot of crashes, maybe you want to focus on those first. And gang mailboxes are one of those things that they look pretty innocuous until they get involved in a crash. They really want to be something you can strike and not have a problem. Here's an example of one. This is actually was tests that were done at that TTI location, and I've started seeing them used in New York State. Okay, so this is actually along a state highway coming into Ithaca. And yes, I'll admit, I've seen they are prone to getting hit by a snowplow and knocked over, just like any mailbox structure. But they're a lot safer if somebody were to hit them. They're designed for that purpose. Okay? So again, that could be starting with a systemic approach where you've got more problems, and then slowly it becomes the standard operating procedure. One of the things we see going around New York State, in fact, actually nationwide, is vehicles tend to cut the corners and you get this edge that's a problem, especially if it's an unpaved edge. And we saw what happens if somebody tries to come up around that. So the idea then is to repair your edge drop-offs at curbs. In West Virginia, and by the way, West Virginia is one of those 5 states that the State Department of Transportation maintains almost every single road, including the local roads, local as in local type of traffic. Um, they started realizing that, if we just put a little bit of asphalt where the vehicles tend to track on the inside of the corner, we can really focus and improve the safety. And they started with the places where they'd had more crashes or the places that were similar to where they'd had more crashes. And eventually it became the standard operating procedure. But it turned out there was a secondary benefit to this, something you might not have thought about. And I don't have a great picture of it. I apologize for it. But when the vehicles do cut the corner, they tend to throw debris up onto the roadway. And so one of the things they were seeing was a huge number of bicycle and motorcycle crashes. And they hadn't thought about that when they started paving the inside of the curbs. But it turns out once they started paving, that debris disappeared, their their bicycle and motorcycle crashes went way down. Just a small crescent-shaped set of asphalt at the curve did a pretty good job. Okay? So, yeah, these are the kind of things you can think about. And yes, somebody put in there the spearing is a potential hazard for the mailboxes. Cutting the corner leads to a safety issue. We want to think about what we can do to improve the vehicle if they do leave the roadway. Okay? Now, Safety Edge is a tool which I wish everybody had as their standard operating procedure. But again, you could start with the places where you've got the most concerns. The standard drop off of asphalt is actually pretty risky. But the idea of the safety edge is you put a wedge, it's about a 30 to 35 degree wedge inside the paver, and it actually puts an edge that people can drive back up onto it. It's a lot safer if a vehicle does go off. And watch the durability. This is a truck the day after it was paved. You do this on a normal asphalt, you're going to destroy that edge. But watch carefully as it comes back up. These two trucks. There's almost no damage whatsoever. Okay? The vehicle just rolls right back up there. It not only does the safety edge make it better for the driver, but it actually improves the durability of the pavement. So until you can get there to back up that pavement, it lasts longer. So it's a win-win for everybody. Because all of us have seen asphalt pavement that didn't get backed up, that gets edge cracking. So again, the safety edge, a good example of something that could be a systemic start and then eventually becomes your standard operating procedure. So as we're thinking about roadway departure countermeasures, keep in mind the idea of a systemic safety approach where we look for the most common or overrepresented types of crashes and we apply the systemic countermeasures. And remember the fatal crash types, when it comes to roadway departures, overturn fatal crashes about 11% of the time. Okay? So that's where we want good shoulders. We want to have good slopes on the sides. Head-ons about 11%. In that particular case, we want to make sure we've got enough center line space, enough lane width, maybe even some extra rumble strips or something in the middle. And then, of course, hit objects is really an issue, and that's 28% of fatal crashes. So maybe we want to focus on the clear zone and getting rid of the trees and using the rail where it's needed, but not where it's not. New York State actually did a study looking at the curve radius, okay? And I actually think this is a pretty good one. And if you think about it, this is the number of curve segments that exist based upon their radius. So 7% of the curves in the study for the state were 100 to 300 foot radius, pretty tight. 10% with 301 to 500 feet, 6% at 500 to 700, and then 5% at 700 to 959. I never quite understood why that, but that's what's in the report. Okay. If we had uniform type of crashes, if it was just a random, completely random function, then we would expect 7% of the serious and fatal crashes to occur on those sharp corners and 10% on the next sharpest corners and so on. But when you actually look at the crash data, 12% of the serious and fatals are occurring on those sharp corners. 12% are also occurring on the 300 to 500 foot segments. In other words, they're overrepresented, which is exactly what we would expect. Sharper corners, people tend to run off the road or cut the corner. It's going to lead to more crashes. In fact, you actually have to get to about a 700-foot radius before you start getting it represented about the same number as you have for the number of segments. So where we want to spend our money? Well, you want to focus on the sharp corners. You want to focus on places that have got higher volumes, higher speeds, things like that. So in that roadway departure safety action plan, especially as I say, please read the appendices. They have risk factors based upon the roadway type, whether it's an arterial, a collector, a local, things like that, at least within the state system. Remember, it's focused mostly on the state system, though they do have a statewide analysis as well. So make sure you read the whole thing. So as an example, for certain collectors, look for your traffic volume. Turns out higher traffic roads tend to be probably a little wider. So maybe look at the traffic volume. That could be a risk factor. Curve radius, obviously sharp curves. Shoulder width, narrow shoulder or even no shoulder. Maybe you focus your money on those locations, and then slowly over time you can do standard operating procedures. So let's just ask real quickly. Give me some common risk factors that you can think about on your roads and streets. Just starting there, okay? Let's see what we got here. What do people have? Animals? Yeah, animals are tough, but animals could be an issue. Trees, snow, mailboxes, okay? Striping or lack thereof, potholes, okay? So you can start making a list. And the cool thing is you make that list and then you go out and you look at data. Okay, we'll talk a lot more about this when we develop the local road safety plan in a couple of weeks. And yeah, I see narrow dirt roads in the Q&A. But you can make a list up. Speed we know is an issue, traffic volume or AADT, lane width, shoulder width. What's the width of the clear zone? Is it consistent? What are the curves and their associated radii or radius? Is the super elevation proper or improper? And of course, have there been previous crashes? And we could argue about whether that's actually a risk factor, but I can tell you right now, always include it, because remember, you're communicating with the public. So how are we going to put all this together? Well, again, we have 1 hour today on combating roadway departures. We'll come back in a couple of weeks, and we'll be talking about local road safety plans 2 weeks from today. A week from now, we'll be talking about federal aid, and we have other webinars as well. So keep that in mind. And just as a quick reminder, little taste, developing a local road safety plan is actually pretty easy. You identify your stakeholders, you use data, this is key, use data to develop your risk factors and choose proven solutions. And then the hard part, you got to implement the solution, okay? So what I want to do is spend our last 12, 13 minutes together, 12 according to my clock on the computer, not the one on the wall, which I told you is a little slow. Let's look at a few proven countermeasures that are available from either the New York State Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan, the Federal Highway Administration, or from some local road safety plans. You can use a locally developed plan with its own data. And in the handout, there's some example plans that are out there, ranging from out in the Seneca Nation to here in Tompkins County, to over down in Chemung County. There's lots of plans out there, and I know more and more people are developing them. In fact, if you happen to be in the Genesee Transportation Council, the GTSC MPO over in Rochester, they're going to do every single county in that area. If you don't have a local road safety plan, you definitely want to have one. But which proven countermeasures? Well, there are lots of them available. In fact, this slide shows all the eligible countermeasures. And if you look at the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan, you can see the list that's available. Again, especially looking in the appendices. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I'm going to add a few more to the clear zone that we've already talked about. Okay, the safety edge that we've already talked about. I'm going to add a few more that we know are relatively low cost and should probably be included in your analysis of your roadway departure safety action plan and your local road safety plan. Okay, first one is pavement markings. Okay, now a lot of you I saw worked for consulting, but a lot did not. Raise your hand if you've got a pavement marking plan. Not just have a few pavement markings, but actually have a plan for replacement. Okay, a few of you do. Good. Okay, good. You need to have a plan in place because we know lines don't last forever, but lines can be very, very important. There's a huge visual value to lines, even on a straight roadway. Okay? Both the center line and the edge line. And yes, there are standards for when you have to put them in, but more importantly, from a safety standpoint, having a plan can make a huge difference because they don't last forever. So, not just meeting the standards, but improving safety. You want to think about having traffic lines. Okay. I know that the lines help me a lot. And of course, these automated vehicles that have the lane assist or even self-driving, they really like those lines as well. Another one you want to add into your queue. Again, if I had to pick one, I would put this critical. And again, yes, there are manual uniform traffic control devices requirements, but that's delineation for horizontal curves. Okay. And it's based both on the traffic volume and the type of roadway, but delineation can make a huge difference. Now, I showed this particular slide coming up in our MUTCD webinar we did a few weeks ago, but you know, we have a little humor, but is there a problem here? Um, we could spend a lot of time on this. There's 4 or 5 problems in this particular location. We need to manage everything, and of course, curb sign placement. Once you decide to put up a sign, there's some requirements that exist. The national MUTCD allows you to just use markings. Once you decide to put something up, here in New York State, because we have this thing called snow, um, you should always put up a sign. We are a sign-driven state. So once you decide, or you're required on certain types of roadways, certain collectors and arterials, you're required to have a sign. But once you decide to put it up, make sure you put up the proper sign, whether it's a turn or curve, and a plaque underneath if it's required. And then delineators going around the corner if it's a sharp change. Okay? New York State is actually going to use chevrons in every single case, but again, we do what we can with what we've got. Delineation is one of those proven countermeasures that absolutely should be part of your safety action plan if you don't already have a standard operating procedure. We should be looking at our curves. We know curves are a major component, and the radius makes a huge difference. Fix those edge drop-offs. We've already shown that before, and we'll show it again. And you could do that by a safety edge. You could do it by improving all the signs and the widening of the roadway. There are tons and tons of different things that you can do to improve the safety along your roadway system. Okay? And again, we're just briefly touching on a few of the ones that are low cost. I didn't even get into rumble strips, okay? Or some of the fancy things you can do with center lines and special lights. I'm a big fan of doing what you can with as low cost as possible. So before we move on to both the money and our PDH questions, do you have any questions about what we've talked about so far? If not, remember, there are funds. All of this we know comes back to money. The Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan, I'll talk a lot more about that in a couple of weeks. And then next week, we are going to be talking about the local federal aid process. If you have not done a local federal aid project, it is a reimbursement program, and you have to get authorization to move from step to step to step. So just keep that in mind. This is not a case of which comes first, the chicken or the egg. You got to have the egg, and then you can have the chicken. Okay, so you got to make sure you do that in the particular order. Now, there are different types of grants that are available, and it depends whether you have a local road safety plan or not. If you don't have a local road safety plan, you can use and get funds to develop one. If you've got a plan, you can get funds to get an implementation grant. So let me just ask you to raise your hand here. Raise your hand if you have, and if you work for a consulting firm, if you have developed a local road safety plan. Raise your hand if you have or have developed a local road safety plan. Okay. So known just a few of you. Okay. The rest of you, we'll definitely want to see you in a couple of weeks to help you develop a local road safety plan. There's two reasons for that. One is whether you're spending your own money or somebody else's, it really helps. It's a great communication tool and reduces your liability. And two, a lot of these funds, if you want the implementation money, the first question they ask you is, do you have a local road safety plan or some equivalent? And if the answer is no, your grant gets put into the stack of only if we have leftover money. And even then, it may not get accepted. So you absolutely need a local road safety plan to get the implementation funds. And remember, there are tons of eligible countermeasures. I didn't even talk about flattening slopes. I didn't talk about barriers much. By the way, I'm a huge fan of barriers used well. I don't like to see them put up just willy-nilly. But there's friction, there's markings beyond just standard markings. There's all kinds of things we can do to improve things that are relatively low cost. Now, I didn't talk about all of them, but let me just ask you, which one of the 6 different things that I talked about today are you thinking about that you'd like to try? Roadside improvement at corners or curves, widening shoulders, um, delineation for horizontal curves, local road safety plans, safety edge, or improved clear zone. Which one of these? And you can click on all of them, by the way. Okay? So again, think about plans. And if you want to say all, and you can just put that in the Q&A, that's fine. Now, some of these will be systematic. Some of them will be systemic, risk-based. In a lot of cases, you're going to start with a systemic approach, and then eventually it becomes a standard operating procedure. Okay? What is the most deadly fixed object? Do you remember? What's the most deadly fixed object? See how y'all do here. Yeah, pretty good. Yeah, trees, 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 trees. Now, that doesn't mean I don't like trees. I really like trees. As you can see, there's a picture of Catterskill Falls behind me. I'm a big fan of trees. But trees need to be part of the overall roadway design. We need to have good, consistent clear zones and not let trees in the more risky locations. Okay? But again, don't just throw rail up in front of them. You may actually make the problem worse. Because while utility poles and guide rail are not the most deadly, they are still deadly fixed objects. So we want to use them where they're needed and move them if we can. And do you remember the 3 FHWA crash focus areas? Can you remember those? Yeah, they're up there. There's pedestrians, there's intersections, and the one we're focusing on today, roadway departures. Okay? So with that, actually, we're in pretty good shape. I want to remind you, we have the special webinar in 2 weeks to talk about local road safety plan and safety funds. Next Tuesday, we're talking about general traffic safety. Okay, so we'll repeat some of this stuff, but that's just a general traffic safety approach, looking at intersections and pedestrians and other traffic safety issues. We're going to talk about federal aid a week from now. That's an online workshop. It's going to be a total of 4 hours. You get 3.5 PDHs if you need them. And then, of course, we're going to be talking about some other funds available week after we talk about traffic safety. And we're finishing our webinar series with snow and ice and pavement maintenance, and we'll be doing our workshops. With that, I think we're at 9:59 according to my clock. Any questions you've got? We got a minute. Any questions? Again, we'd love to have more time to cover all these things, but we get 1 hour. The mind can absorb what the can endure. With that, I want to thank everybody for joining us on a nice snowy day. Hope everybody stays safe. And remember, you are part of the equation to make everybody safe and get home safely every single day. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.